What if your biggest struggle with backgrounds could be fixed with just 3 missing links? I've spent 25 years drawing portraits and experimented with thousands of backgrounds, discovering each link the hard way. So to save you years of frustration, I'm going to show you why backgrounds fail, what makes them belong to the portrait, and how to stop guessing them altogether. First, let me show you how I discovered the first missing link. For years, I'd scroll online, fascinated by portraits that felt like more than just a realistic face. They had movement, energy, and visual language. They made the whole piece feel alive because it had a beautiful, expressive background. And I'd think, that's exactly what I want to create. So I'd spend hours on a portrait, get to a point where I was genuinely happy with it, but then completely freeze when it came to the background because I had no idea what to do with it. I knew I wanted something creative, but I was terrified of ruining what I've already built. So I'd play it safe, and more often than not, I'd end up with something like this. Just a thick, uneven shape that compressed the whole portrait and made it feel really stiff and heavy. And it used to be soul destroying because I felt like I'd craft something actually quite nice and then just kind of rolled it up into my dog's poo bag. Now here's where it gets interesting, because it wasn't until I stopped using the grid method that almost immediately my work went from this to this. Suddenly that constrained look disappeared. The backgrounds felt lighter, more natural, and it wasn't just a one-off. It kept happening. So I asked myself one question: what actually changed? So I looked back through my progress photos and saw something very interesting. When I used the grid, it was a very concentrated and dense process of structure, shading, and background, with tight, small movements building the portrait and the background almost like a 3D printer. As a result, I'd have this heavy, compressed weight around the portrait with no breathing room. But when I moved to freehand, the first thing that I do is just get charcoal on the paper and start building into it. Naturally, the charcoal spilled beyond the portrait, so without even planning it, I was building the background and the portrait at the same time. This meant that artwork became cohesive because everything was working together. I was basing the portrait against the background, and I was basing the background against the portrait. This is where I discovered the first missing link. The background isn't just something that you bolt on at the end as an afterthought. You build them together. But here's the thing. Once I solved that, it naturally created another problem. I thought I now have the key, the secret, and those beautiful expressive backgrounds that inspired me were there for the taking. And it worked, and it created pieces like this. That was it. I cracked it. But then I would draw, but then I would draw something like this and think, well, that's not very good, is it? If it was very stiff and awkward again. And I continued this cycle for a very long time. But here's where it gets interesting again. How I discovered the second link was actually really surprising. I was watching a lot of Portrait Artist of the Year at that time, and the rules of the competition is to complete a portrait in 4 hours. And I really liked that challenge, so I started drawing my portraits in that time frame. And then this started happening. Can you see the difference? Because I only had 4 hours, I didn't have time to create a huge expressive background. It forced me to simplify. Each background looks like it belongs. It supports and complements the portrait. It acts as an accent. That's when I realized why these didn't work. Not because the backgrounds were bad, kind of, but because they didn't belong to the portrait. The easiest way to think about it is this. Imagine someone serves you a portion of chips, but with ice cream as the sauce. Ice cream isn't the problem. Ice cream's great, it just doesn't belong with the chips. Portraits work in the exact same way. These two have very similar backgrounds, but this one works because it belongs to the portrait. The dress, the broken light tones, the high contrast accents. The background reinforces the exact same language. Now compare that to this one. It doesn't work at all. But because it worked with this one, I was trying to force the same style. Once I realized that backgrounds work when you view the piece as what does the portrait need, rather than trying to force something creative into it, I started noticing a pattern. If I showed you these, can you see what they all have in common? Even though stylistically they all look different, but they all follow the same background structure. You have a value mask coming from the light area from the top of the head, and then you have the open bottom of the portrait. I call it the open end look. It creates a visual language regardless of the style because it follows the value and contrast of the portrait, and as a result, it leads your eye all the way through the portrait. Now I like to test, and I tested this a lot, and it worked again and again and again. I then started noticing it everywhere. That was the second missing link. Good backgrounds aren't random. Most of the time, they follow a structure of values and contrast that supports the portrait. But here's the issue. That gave me consistency, but it had a ceiling. I'd still see work like this and think, that's incredible. There's so much movement and expression, and there's more to it than just the open-end look. I'd feel inspired all over again, but this time I had the skills. I understood backgrounds, or at least I thought I did. The moment I started drawing, I'd lose my nerve again and I'd play it safe. Except now playing it safe wasn't a stiff compressed background. It was the open-end look, which isn't a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing to have a go-to background, because if you're experimenting with edges, composition, or values, having a reliable background means you can focus all of your attention on that one thing. But the issue was, backgrounds were the very thing I was trying to expand on. My go-to then became my comfort zone. The moment I stepped outside of that, I was right back into getting inconsistent results again. After feeling defeated, sacrificing yet another drawing to a background that didn't work, I decided instead of putting all of the uncertainty into a drawing that I'd spent hours on, I'd move the experiment into somewhere that had nothing to lose, which gave me that third and last missing link. If an author writes drafts before finalizing and films rehearse scenes before shooting, why not create mock-ups before doing your final piece? I know, right? Painfully obvious. Here's the issue, right? A portrait literally tells you what to draw. The shadows go here, the lights go there. A background doesn't. That's why so many artists freeze when they get to it. So instead of solving that problem on a portrait you've already spent so many hours on, it can be solved with a sketch in like 20 minutes. Now here's the thing, you don't need to do a mock-up with every single drawing that you do. I absolutely love working out the elements of a drawing in real time. It's how you discover those light bulb moments. But if you have a very specific idea in your head, a 20-minute mock-up removes the guesswork and can save you hours of frustration on the final piece. Here's the key. These 3 missing links will help you create some beautiful backgrounds, but none of them will work without strong values. If your portrait doesn't have clear light and dark shapes to begin with, no background is going to make it better. So watch this video next where I show you the simplest way to understand values so every background has a portrait worth supporting.